Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 6 Month Promise podcast with Anthony Conceicao, the show where we talk to people from all walks of life, teens and adults pursuing their dreams, living one day at a time. If they have a story to share, then we have an ear to lend. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you don't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. You can also find us on SoundCloud under the 6 Month Promise podcast, and make sure you follow us on Instagram or Facebook, also under the 6 Month Promise podcast. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the 6 Month Promise podcast with your host, Anthony Conceicao. Today's episode is pretty cool because I'm talking to somebody I like very, very much, Mr. Kenny Phillips. He is a paramedic, and he's going to be over here talking a little bit about what he does for a living and a little bit about his background, different things like that. How you doing, Mr. Kenny?
I'm doing great.
Thank you for coming on the show today.
No problem.
So, before we start talking about the paramedic part of your life, let's go back a little bit and start talking a little bit about what it was growing up and things like that. So you're from Charlotte, born and raised, right?
Correct, I am.
So what was it like, growing up back in old Charlotte and things like that?
A lot less traffic. I grew up in South Charlotte, so it was I grew up in a town in a town called Pineville, and it was just a small town. It was everyone knew each other, and there was no fear to kick your kids out of the house and tell them to come back when it started getting dark. I mean, I spent a lot of my time as a kid in the woods and just doing crazy kid stuff that parents would never get away with letting their kids do now. Yeah. So there was a lot of open fields. There was a lot of farmland. We rode motorcycles and go-karts and four-wheelers all over the town, and nobody said a word. We'd ride them on the street. Nobody would say a word. And the police department, I think, had like 3 police officers, and the chief used to come over to my house and and hang out with my parents, and it was just a perfect childhood.
Did you get in a lot of trouble or something like that?
No, we never got in trouble because, it wasn't like it is now. Everything now is so liberalized. It's like, oh, you can't spank your kid, or you can't do this, or you can't do that. You can't take your eye off of your kid. I mean, I remember like when I was 4 years old, being out in the woods 2 miles away from my house with friends the same age, and we were just playing in the woods, throwing rocks in the creek and all that stuff. It was just a different time. It was a better time. Much better time.
So when it comes to like now raising your own kids, do you think you'd still let them with that mentality of like, oh, I don't mind them going out and things like that, or do you still...
No. I'm still very much the get out of the house, let them go play, let them discover who they are. And I'm very liberal when it comes to that. Let them just go and have a good time. My wife has to reel me back in a little bit because she's more, no, we need to
be more careful.
Be more careful. There's bad people in the world. We don't... Stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, like, that kind of makes sense because also, Charlotte has changed a lot, like, since, things that were back then. Do you think now because of the fact that people a lot from, like, more prone to, like, the north are coming down here and things are changing down here, do you think then you'd be a little bit like, oh, then maybe we shouldn't because things aren't the same?
I don't think it really has anything to do with the people that are coming to Charlotte from other parts of the country. I just think that whatever it is, there's some sick people in the world, and I don't know what causes it. Maybe it's a lack of Christ in their life. Maybe it's fatherless homes. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's the mothers that have to have 3 jobs to make ends meet because they've got 4 kids. But there's some deviance out there now that we didn't experience when I was a child. So, Yeah, I mean, we let our kids run around and go out in the yard and play, and they know all the rules about, if somebody walks up, they run in the house, or they don't approach any cars, they don't go into the street, and all that stuff. But it was just a simpler time back then. It was just very simple, and what I think was a lot better.
Any like really good memories that you can remember?
Yeah, I mean, just riding dirt bikes in the woods. And
would you say that was like probably one of the best memories that you have? Would be like back in the day riding dirt bikes?
Absolutely, doing that, and walking out in the backyard. And when we were kids, I was like 10 or 11. Yeah, maybe 10 or 11 years old. My dad bought me my first gun. So I remember going outside and just standing on the back porch of the house and shooting and all kind of things. And go out and during like dove season.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'd just go out in the back because there was a big farm behind my house. You know? We just go out on the corner of the farm, and the farmer didn't mind, and we would just wait for the doves to fly over to go over, to try to get whatever, and we'd shoot doves. And,
oh wow.
Where Carolina Place Mall is, so all that used to be a farm. And
really?
Yeah, and we used to rabbit hunt out there. And when I got a little bit older, and I think I was 16 before I started deer hunting. But it was just there was not a big stigma upon guns back then. It was just like a rite of passage. You got your first gun, and
the way it was.
Yeah,
it's like a car now. That's crazy, actually.
That was the South. That's the way it was. And I enjoyed it, and I want my kids to experience that. And of course, that's why we're moving out of Mecklenburg County and
deeper into
South Carolina, to where we can have that environment.
That's great. Do you think? Well, I mean, because it's easy to become accustomed to, the video game life and things like that. The way that things are like now. Do you think you're still going to be able to like give them, or that they would still even be interested in having that sort of lifestyle, going outside, going hunting, doing all that type of stuff?
Well, the kids are going to make the decisions that they want to make. You, in my opinion, you don't force anything on your kids. You expose them to things, and if they like it, then they'll follow it. But there is a constant battle with video games. I'm not going to lie. Because that's what their friends are talking about. So they want to be able to fit in with their kids or with their friends, and I understand that. But luckily, my kids are a little bit young right now to be able to. We can control a lot of the things that they do right now. But as they get older, I will expose them to more and more things, and they will either like it or they won't. And I think the secret of being a parent is to expose your kids to as much as you can, and then what they fall in love with, you support.
That's good. That's a good way to think about it, actually. I feel like a lot of parents lack that sort of line between of like what is the thing you should be supporting and what's the thing you should be exposing to.
Right. Now, obviously, if it's something that's going to kill them, we don't want that. But but there's you can't be a parent in today's world and think that video games are not very important to kids. You can't be a part of this world and think that social media is not important to kids. Or when I was a kid, there was no computers. There was no cell phones. There was nothing like that. So that stuff has influenced life in a big way, and you can't hide children from that. You just got to monitor them to make good decisions while they're using them. So
I mean, and also in a way I would even go as far to say that it's a good survival skill, to be able to have that sort of background and have that sort of going out, not being scared to like you know, like a lot of people are scared to even go out camping, which is something that's so trivial, and it shouldn't even be a big deal. But a lot of people, because they weren't exposed to that, don't even like spending like the smallest amount of time in the wilderness. So it's good to have that background, so you like in a sense prepared for the worst if it come, you know.
Yeah, I'm not a big prepper or a big person that believes that the world is going to end, because my foundation is in God. I think God knows when all that's going to happen, and He's going to take us out of that before, you know, we really have to suffer. But one of the things we like to say is, you know, you buy a kid a fish, he'll eat for just a minute. If you teach him how to fish, he will eat forever. It's pretty much the same thing as in the Bible, you know. So you teach him to hunt, and he will eat forever. It's just what they really. I'm not forcing anything on my kids, and my lifestyle is not necessarily theirs. So I can lead them like I'm supposed to do. But they will find what their passion is, and we must develop those passions as long as they're in a good, constructive way, so they can be well-rounded humans when they get older.
Now, sort of trying to get a little bit back to you know, the main topic here. Do you think, you know, you mentioned how you the police. Was it the commissioner, or was it just the head of police, the captain? Police chief. He would go over to your house and he would talk to your parents and have dinner and things like that. And he was like a family friend, right?
Right.
Do you think having that exposure to like a first responder at all put you on like the path for being a paramedic, or did that even?
Not at all. I remember when I was a kid. So when I was younger, there was like no electronics, you know, and paging systems were very crude. So, have you ever heard the nuclear siren go off, like in the tornado warning?
I've seen videos of it, but never. Yeah.
Okay. Well, all of the fire departments back in that day, most of the fire departments, not all, but most of the fire departments back in that day were all volunteer. So to notify the firemen that there was a call, there was one of those big sirens on top of the fire station. And you could hear it all over town. So when it goes off, it was loud, and it spun, and it would notify all the volunteer firemen that there were a call, and they would all rush to the fire station to see where the call was, and then to respond to it. So I can remember being that young and hearing that go off and be wow. And then I would go out and watch the street, and then all the firemen, would be headed to the fire station, and they had little red lights on their cars, and it was to me, it was like, whoa, man, they're really,
these are heroes.
These are people that are just stopping everything, because like if they were at work, their bosses would let them leave to go.
That's kind of awesome, though.
Yeah. So you would just
Batman with the bat signal sort of thing.
Exactly.
Like you got a job, but you get
exactly. And my cousin, who was a good bit older than me, he was a EMT at that time, and a firefighter with the fire department in Pineville. So I would always hang out with him, you know, go to his house, and then of course when the alarm went off, he would leave, and then I would go home. And I would ask him, you know, was it a fire, or was it this, was it that? And I really got interested then. All right, and so I remember that from the very youngest of my age. When I was probably 8 or 9 years old, that's when I started hanging out at the fire department in Pineville, just with the firemen and their kids, and we were just all really good friends, you know. And my parents were never involved in the fire department or in emergency services in any way, but they supported me doing it. Okay. And so I really didn't know it was going to lead to a life of this.
Not to cut you off, but what did your parents do then?
My dad owned his own business, and my mom was a housewife, stay-at-home mother.
Mom. Mm-hmm.
So, but I remember doing that, and just hanging out and having fun and
just being a kid.
Being a kid.
Mm-hmm. And then watching these heroes run by.
Yeah, and then I was in the Boy Scouts, and we were on this camping trip with the Boy Scouts, and one of our scout leaders fell down this really deep ravine, and they had to call for help because he was hurt. He couldn't get up. So I remember the firemen coming out into the woods where we were camping, and we were pretty far off the road, and they set up all these ropes and pulleys and all this stuff, and they got down into this ravine with him, and they loaded him up on this it's called a Stokes basket, but it's a basket that you carry people in. They put him in that, and then they hoisted him up, and they took him off to the hospital, and I was like, man, how did they learn to do all that? That was just cool to me,
So how old were you then?
10 maybe.
Oh wow.
10 or 11.
Goodness gracious. So it was like that was your first exposure to seeing paramedics at work.
Right. And then when I was probably around 12 years old, I was with my cousin, and we were in his car, and by this time they had something called they had pagers. All right. So you'd be riding down the road, and then his pager would go off, and it'd beep, 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 like that. And then it was actually an audio pager, so it would tell you where the call was. So
you could just go straight.
You could hear the dispatcher. So he was, and it was a motorcycle wreck. And so I remember taking off with him in his personal vehicle, and we go to this motorcycle accident. And so he told me to stay in the car, and which I did because I was young, But I remember looking, and the guy was dead. The guy died. And he was laying in a ditch, and the guy's head was turned all the way around backwards. It broke his neck. And instead of being horrified at that sight, I was like, wow. I mean, it was
fascinating.
It was fascinating that this had happened. So that got me in the fire department even more.
Yeah.
So when I was 13 or 14 years old, they had a junior fireman program. So I joined as a junior firefighter. And you didn't get to do a whole lot. You got to go on calls, but you couldn't get out of the truck and stuff like that. And then when I was 13, the local EMS service had a explorers program through the Boy Scouts. So I joined that. And then I got to ride on an ambulance all the time. So when it came between the fire service and EMS, I found myself really gravitating to the EMS side because I was amazed at learning about the human body and learning about the bones and the circulatory system and the neurological system and all of that kind of stuff, And so I really just pretty much forgot about my regular school and tried to learn everything I could about the body, which drove my parents crazy because my grades were failing at school, but I was gaining all this other knowledge, which, I figured out that by high school that I needed to do both. So I turned all that around, and I started making really good grades in high school and still learning as much as I could while being in the Explorer Post and the junior fireman and all that. So that's how it all began for me.
And that's just puts you on the path now. And so you didn't go into any other profession or anything, or you weren't even questioning is this what I wanted to do?
No, I was lucky. I was lucky because I never had the thought when I was a kid, man, what am I going to do with my life?
You just
always knew what I wanted to do.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, I was very fortunate.
Oh, wow. So, while you were in school, was there anything that specifically was like challenging to you? Like, what was one of the hardest things that you had to
Algebra.
Algebra?
Oh, it sucked.
Wow.
Algebra. Couldn't do it.
Not a math person. Totally a science person.
I was a D.C. student in algebra.
Mm-hmm.
I was an A student in geometry. So geometry made sense to me because I could see it.
Mm-hmm.
All right,
So,
the shapes,
visual learning. Okay.
Yeah, so that is when I figured out that I'm a visual learner.
Mm-hmm.
So you can put a stack of books in front of me, and I may take out 2 or 3 things.
Mm-hmm.
But if you let me learn by watching,
Mm-hmm.
then I'll ace it every time.
No.
So
How do you think that translated when you decided to go into, school for
EMS.
the EMS? Yeah.
So I was lucky because EMT school.
Mm-hmm.
I went to EMT school when I was 18,
Mm-hmm.
and did really good in EMT school, obviously, because I was just really interested in it.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the curriculum of being an EMT I'd already learned through the Explore program and through the fire department.
Mm-hmm.
So I excelled in EMT school. Then I got the job that I have now.
Mm-hmm. How old?
I was 19 years old when I got hired with the local EMS service.
Oh, wow.
And that was in July of '92. So I worked as an EMT for 5 years, I think, before I decided to go to become a paramedic. So what that did for me was that gave me 5 years of learning from a paramedic who was my partner. And so when I got to paramedic school and we started talking about things like congestive heart failure, I'd already seen that stuff. All right,
familiar with it.
I was familiar with it. I understood because I had seen somebody actually in congestive heart failure. So I was able to say, okay, I understand that is right heart failure. Now I understand why it backs up into the lungs and causes fluid. And I understand that if I give this person this medication and this medication, how it works to help the patient feel better. So I finished second in my class in paramedic school.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it was very beneficial to me.
Goodness. What do you think? So going into that, I mean, that's just something that you had to learn, but it wasn't something that was like the reason you were there wasn't to understand, medicine or anything like that. It was for the fact of, would you describe it as the rush of like going in and saving people and helping and doing that, or did you?
So it started off. I started off my career just because of the adrenaline.
The adrenaline.
Yeah, driving fast, lights and sirens. But when I got into paramedic school, it was really about understanding some of these medical conditions out there, and then it got really cool to me because I could understand what was going on with somebody, and I could give them medication to make them feel better.
And then that's when it starts to like sway into like you realizing like the bigger picture in a sense.
Yeah. So it turned, and then because I was still pretty young, I was in my early 20s, they were never really people to me. All right, they were conditions, and I knew how to fix that condition in the ambulance before we got to the hospital. But as I got older, I started putting the people with the condition. Yeah, so that's when I think the compassion came in.
Is it easier to do the job thinking as condition, do you think? Or is it better now that you think of them as people?
I think that you have to have a healthy respect for both. Okay? I think that the people who do it just as compassion and really get attached to their patients, they usually have a hard time later in their career because people die, and it's hard for some of us to let that go. In paramedic school, they don't teach you that people die. They teach you that you save them, that you take care of them, So when you have a patient that dies, it's kind of hard to deal with sometimes because you're like, man, I did everything that I was taught to do. I've learned all of these skills and I did them all flawlessly. And this person died. And then you start saying, well, did I do something wrong? Did I not act fast enough? And then that leads down a horrible road called PTSD that we all hear about.
Did you ever have a moment where you were like, you felt that way of like, did I do something wrong?
Of course I have. I've had that. And I've had the depression. I've had the feeling that I was just not good enough, that these people were dying and I was still just going through the motions and, things just weren't working out. So it questions your ability. It questions your education. It questions everything until you get to the point that you realize, man, people do die. It's a part of life. And sometimes the conditions that they have are bad enough, or somebody has waited so long to get care that they were just past the point of no return. And then that really causes you to question why you're really here. Why am I really working my butt off to try to save these people when they're just going to die anyway? It's a horrible thought to have. So I went through several years of feeling like I was lost. And I was lucky, man, because I realized one day, I heard somebody say this, and I was a young kid, just kind of crazy, doing all kind of craziness, medicating myself with marijuana and alcohol and all kind of things. And I remember this old paramedic that worked for us, and he said, if you're going to take credit for saving somebody's life, then you have to take credit or you have to take responsibility when somebody dies. And I said, whoa, that's a big statement. And I said, well, what do you do? And he says, Kenny, he said, you haven't gotten to the point yet to where you realize that God controls everything. He said, when I come to work, he said, I pray that Jesus uses my hands as an extension of his. And whether I lay my hands on them and they get better, that's God's will. Or if I lay my hands on them and they die, that's God's will. And I started saying, well, good gracious. What does all this mean? And it connected with me. And I started seeking out God, and I started seeking pastors and churches just to try to understand. I still don't think I was very religious, but I was hurting,
At that point, do you stop viewing yourself like, you don't view yourself like, oh, I'm like this person in the sense of like a hero, because it's not you doing it.
Right. So I don't, no, I'm not a hero. Okay. What we say in the business is we don't want to be a hero, because usually heroes are dead, right? They've done something to try to save somebody's life, and they've given their life in the process. Well, I don't want to be a hero. Okay. I don't want to die. What I want to be is I want to be a kind soul that recognizes if this is your last day and there's nothing I can do about it, then if you die with me, I want you to know that you're dying with a good friend. I want you to know that you're going to die with somebody holding your hand with a smile on their face. And I want you to understand that if you have a condition that I can fix, that's going to prevent you from dying, then I'm going to do that with vigor, with a kind voice and a smile on my face. And I think that's how God would want it.
Yeah.
And that's what I choose. That's how I choose to deal with the bad things. So
that's a good way of thinking about it, though.
Yeah, and it's prevented me from having PTSD. It's prevented me from going down the road of substance abuse. It's, being a paramedic, the one thing that you need to understand about a paramedic is they're just like you. They're no different. They're human beings. They have feelings and emotions. And when they are repeatedly exposed to very, very bad situations and very just really horrible stuff, that it can change you as a person. It can make you very jaded, and it can cause those PTSD symptoms. And these people are not heroes. They're not superhuman. They're just like you. They just chose to do a job to try to help people. So there's a big push in the EMS community right now about how are we going to deal with these issues with our employees. So we put a lot of focus in that nowadays, where there was no focus in it when I started.
It was just deal with it your own way.
That's right.
Man, goodness. How do you? I mean, when you do a job like this and you're trying to yourself fix the way you think about things, and you're trying to find out a way. How do you deal with people around you? Because I mean, there has to be people around you that fall into that trap of PTSD and things like that. Like, how do you deal with having those friends, people you?
The first thing you have to do is recognize it. So you have to recognize when they're going through a rough time, and you can recognize that either with their performance, or maybe they're calling out sick to work a lot, or you're just noticing that they're withdrawn and not really talking a lot to people. You have to recognize that, and then you go and talk to them, and then they have to be courageous enough to say, yeah, I'm having some problems. And then when that happens, the door's open. We can get them the help that they need. Before, we lost more people, not locally but nationally. We lost more people in the EMS industry last year to suicide than we did in line of duty deaths. Just because these are regular people that are being exposed to horrible situations multiple times a day. So we have to really consider the mental health of a paramedic. Just like if you went through a horrible situation one time, it could change you. We just have to be more vigilant with our staff.
Goodness. Now, we are kind of running a little bit on time here. I did want to touch a little bit, since we were talking about this a little earlier. So, being a paramedic is your main career, we'll say, or your main job.
Correct.
But you also have started would you consider it like a side business, or?
So I've been a paramedic for 27 years now. Longer than that if you think about whenever I started, when I was 10, 11, 12 years old, And I count that because I was exposed to the business then. So I've been a paid paramedic for almost 30 years, and I retire in 3 years. Oh, wow. And even though I'm going to have a pension and insurance and all that stuff, I'm still going to be young. I'll be 49 years old when I retire.
Oh,
so I wanted to start a business that means something to me, that I was doing for myself and not having to work for somebody else. And so I started a company that we do, custom manufacturing of weapons, guns mainly, and other services like Cerakote weapons and accessories and things of that nature.
Do you think a lot because your background and things like that. Do you think that you would put that almost as if like your second passion, like if being a paramedic and having that sort of like side of life is?
Well, yeah.
your main
I mean,
thing?
it was because that's how I grew up. I grew up hunting and fishing and shooting, and that is something that never left me. So when I was thinking about what it is that I want to do when I retire, it was a natural fit for me. So I already know a lot about it, and it's what I enjoy.
And I do like the name of the company. So if you want to talk a little bit about coming up with the name.
The company's name is Wyatt's Tactical Solutions, and I named it after my son. And all the serial numbers on my guns that I build start with JDP, which is my daughter's initials.
Oh, I didn't know that actually. Wow.
Yep. So my son's name is on every weapon, and my daughter's name is on every weapon.
That's awesome. So, as a paramedic, do you think that selling guns and things like that? Do you find it like, because you're saving people a lot of times who haven't gotten into situations where they're injured because of a gun and things like that? Do you think it contradicts at all the fact that you're now going to be selling guns?
I don't think so, and the reason why is because criminals don't come and buy guns from me. Okay, I serve responsible, law-abiding gun owners, and they come, they purchase a weapon, I do background checks, and if there's anything on the FBI database that I use that comes back, they don't get a gun. Or if somebody comes and gets a gun and they just rub me the wrong way, then they don't get a gun, because I don't have to sell it to them. I don't need the money. I've got a job. I've got a job I love very much. So if it's, I get to make that decision. And so, no, I don't find it at all a contradiction of what I do. It's just, look, guns don't hurt people.
People hurt people.
People hurt people. A gun is a tool, just like a hammer is. Right? You can use a gun to go hunting or target shooting, and done responsibly, there's no problems whatsoever. A hammer is a tool. You take it and you build a house. Used responsibly, it could create a beautiful house. But if I turn around with that hammer with malicious intent and hit you in the head with it,
you'll kill me.
You're going to die.
Exactly.
It's the malicious intent. It's the person. So, no, I don't find any contradiction with it at all.
That's awesome. Well, Mr. Kenny, I think we're going to have to wrap it up around here.
Cool.
I would love to have you back on the show. I mean, I feel like we could definitely continue talking about this for, hours and hours on end.
Absolutely.
I do enjoy talking to you a lot. And before we go, if there's just something that, for somebody that wants to become a paramedic, if there was something you wanted to maybe hear at your age, when you started, is there something you would want to say to somebody that's just now starting?
I would say it's a hard job. It's very difficult to do 30 years in that job. But you have to educate yourself and be marketable to other positions. So, like me, I don't ride an ambulance anymore. Okay, so I'm one of the shift supervisors. So I have my own vehicle, and I choose the calls that I go on, and my job is mainly to support and to take care of my employees. So I would tell people that, yes, become an EMT. It's a great experience. Yes, become a paramedic, but don't let that be the only thing that you do. Okay? Learn some stuff about human resources. Learn stuff about teaching. Learn things about leading a group of people. Because that is very marketable in the industry right now. So when you are done or you feel like when you feel like you're done. Excuse me.
You're fine.
When you feel like that you're done riding an ambulance,
Mm-hmm.
there's other things in the industry that you can do so you can retire
Mm-hmm.
and get those benefits.
So make yourself marketable and keep adding to the portfolio. That's right.
Absolutely.
All
Just
right.
like you would do any other profession.
Exactly. All righty, Mr. Kenny, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All righty. We will see you guys later.